Picture this. You're lying on a surgical table. The anesthesiologist asks you to count backward from 10. 10, 9, 8, and then nothing. Not sleep, not dreams, not darkness. Nothing. A complete erasure of time itself. 2 minutes pass, 2 hours, 2 days. You wouldn't know the difference. One moment you're counting, the next you're waking up in recovery, and an entire chunk of your existence has been cleanly excised from reality. Where did you go? This isn't a philosophical riddle. It's a question that haunts the very foundation of what we think we know about minds and brains. Because somewhere in that gap, in that perfect nothingness, lies the deepest mystery we've ever encountered. The mystery of why anything feels like anything at all. Think about it. Right now, as you listen to these words, something extraordinary is happening inside your skull. Billions of neurons are firing in precise patterns, electrochemical signals cascading through networks of impossible complexity. But here's what's truly bizarre. All of that neural activity doesn't just process information. It feels like something. The redness of red doesn't just help you stop at traffic lights. It blooms in your consciousness like a flower made of pure experience. The pain of a pinprick doesn't just signal tissue damage, it hurts, with a quality that seems to have no place in a world of atoms and void. This is what philosophers call the hard problem of consciousness. Not just explaining what the brain does, but why doing anything at all should feel like something from the inside. Let me show you just how strange this really is. Imagine, if you can, a being identical to you in every conceivable way. Every neuron fires in exactly the same pattern. Every behavior is perfectly matched. This being laughs at the same jokes, cries at the same movies, claims to see the same colors you see. But here's the twist. Inside, there's nobody home. No inner light, no subjective experience whatsoever. Just biological machinery executing its programs in perfect darkness. Philosophers call this a zombie. Not the Hollywood kind, but something far more unsettling. A philosophical zombie that challenges everything we think we know about consciousness. If such a being is even conceivable, then what exactly makes your inner light turn on? Or consider Mary, the color scientist. She spent her entire life in a black and white room, studying color through monitors that show only shades of gray. She knows every physical fact about color, every wavelength, every neural pathway involved in color vision, every behavioral response colors trigger. She is, in every objective sense, the world's leading expert on color. But Mary has never actually seen red. Now imagine the moment she steps outside and sees a red rose for the first time. Does she learn something new? Something that all her scientific knowledge couldn't capture? And if so, what exactly is this mysterious something that seems to exist beyond the physical facts of the world? Then there's John Searle's Chinese room. Imagine a person who speaks no Chinese locked in a room with an enormous instruction manual. Chinese symbols come in through a slot. The person follows the manual's rules to manipulate these symbols and outputs perfectly fluent Chinese responses. From the outside, the room appears to understand Chinese perfectly. But does it really understand anything at all? Or is it just shuffling meaningless symbols according to rules? These aren't just abstract puzzles. They point to something that should terrify us. We may be living in a universe where we fundamentally cannot tell the difference between genuine consciousness and its perfect imitation, and the stakes couldn't be higher. Every decision we make about what deserves moral consideration, every patient lying unconscious in a hospital bed, every animal in a laboratory, every artificial intelligence that might one day claim to feel, depends on our ability to recognize consciousness when we see it. Get it wrong, and we risk two catastrophic errors, either inflicting suffering on beings we fail to recognize as conscious, or extending moral consideration to systems that are nothing more than sophisticated mimicry. But here's what's most unsettling of all. Experience isn't just some interesting feature of reality we happen to possess. It's the only thing that makes reality matter at all. A universe without consciousness would be a universe where nothing is beautiful or terrible, where nothing matters to anyone, where there is literally no point to anything. Experience is the light that illuminates meaning itself. And yet it's the one thing about reality we understand least. How did we get ourselves into this predicament? How did the most intimate aspect of our existence become the most mysterious? To understand that, we need to trace the intellectual journey that led us here. A journey through centuries of brilliant minds trying and failing to fit consciousness neatly into our scientific picture of the world. The mystery didn't start with modern neuroscience. It began the moment human beings first wondered what they were made of. In the 17th century, René Descartes drew a line through reality that we're still trying to erase. On one side, res extensa, the physical world of extension, motion, and mechanical interaction. On the other, res cogitans, the mental world of thought, feeling, and consciousness. Mind and matter, forever separated by an unbridgeable conceptual gulf. Descartes thought he was solving the problem of consciousness by giving it its own metaphysical territory. Instead, he created what may be philosophy's most enduring puzzle. If mind and matter are fundamentally different substances, how do they interact? How does your immaterial soul move your material body? How does physical brain damage affect mental experience? But it was Gottfried Leibniz who really twisted the knife. He asked us to imagine the brain scaled up to the size of a mill, large enough that we could walk through it and observe all its mechanical operations. We would see wheels turning, levers moving, fluids flowing, all the intricate machinery of neural computation. But nowhere, Leibniz insisted, would we see a thought. Nowhere would we find the redness of red, or the pain of pain. This wasn't just philosophical speculation. It was a prophecy of exactly the situation we find ourselves in today. We can map neural circuits with extraordinary precision, track the flow of information through the brain, even predict behavior from brain scans. But the more we learn about the mechanics, the more mysterious the experience becomes. John Locke tried a different approach. Maybe, he suggested, some qualities we experience, colors, tastes, smells, aren't really in the world at all. They're secondary qualities that exist only in the interaction between objects and perceiving minds. A rose isn't really red. Redness is something our visual system constructs in response to certain wavelengths of light. This was a crucial insight, but it only deepened the mystery. If experience is constructed by the brain, then we're not passive receivers of reality. We're active creators of it. But this raises an even more puzzling question. Who or what is doing the creating? William James, writing at the dawn of the 20th century, gave us the phrase stream of consciousness. For James, consciousness wasn't a thing but a process, a continuous flow of experience that creates the very sense of being a unified self, moving through time. But even this beautiful metaphor left the fundamental question unanswered. Why should any information processing system have a stream of experience at all? Then came the behaviorists, led by figures like John Watson and B.F. Skinner. Frustrated by the apparent unscientific nature of consciousness, they made a bold move. They decided to ignore it entirely. Science should study behavior, they declared. Observable inputs and outputs. What happens in the mysterious black box of the mind is irrelevant. Gilbert Ryle went even further, dismissing consciousness as a ghost in the machine, a conceptual confusion that would disappear once we properly understood behavior and function. For several decades, psychology tried to proceed as if consciousness didn't exist. But consciousness refused to stay buried. In 1950, Alan Turing proposed his famous test. If a machine could engage in conversation indistinguishable from a human, should we consider it intelligent? The Turing test was elegant, but it made a fateful assumption. that intelligence and consciousness could be judged purely from external behavior. This set the stage for the computational revolution in cognitive science. If minds were like computers, then consciousness might be what it feels like to run certain kinds of programs. But this just pushed the mystery back one level. Why should running any program feel like anything at all? In 1974, Thomas Nagel delivered what may be philosophy's most devastating thought experiment. He asked a simple question: what is it like to be a bat? A bat's reality is constructed around echolocation. It experiences the world through sound in ways we can barely imagine. But here's Nagel's crucial point. No matter how much we learn about bat neurology, no matter how completely we map their sonar processing systems, we will never truly know what their experience feels like from the inside. And if that's true for bats, Nagel argued, it might be true for consciousness in general. Objective science might be fundamentally limited in its ability to capture subjective experience. We might be trying to solve the wrong kind of problem with the wrong kind of tools. Joseph Levine, writing in the 1980s, gave this puzzle a name: the explanatory gap. Even if we could perfectly describe every neural mechanism involved in consciousness, there would still be a gap, a conceptual chasm, between those mechanisms and the felt quality of experience. Why should neural activity pattern A produce the experience of red rather than blue? Why should it produce any experience at all rather than just computational processing in the dark? Meanwhile, neuroscience was making extraordinary progress. Studies of patients like Phineas Gage showed that changes to the brain could dramatically alter personality and consciousness. But these discoveries only highlighted the puzzle. Correlation isn't explanation. We could see that brain states were connected to conscious states, but we still had no idea why. This is the intellectual landscape that David Chalmers entered in 1995, when he gave the mystery its definitive name: the hard problem of consciousness. Chalmers made a crucial distinction: the easy problems of consciousness, attention, memory, perception, report, were just problems of explaining cognitive functions. Difficult, perhaps, but the kind of problems science knew how to solve in principle. But the hard problem was different. It wasn't asking what consciousness does, but why consciousness exists at all. Why is there something it's like to be you? Why isn't the universe just atoms and void, processing information in perfect darkness? Neuroscientists like Francis Crick and Christoph Koch began searching for the neural correlates of consciousness, the specific brain patterns associated with conscious experience. They made remarkable discoveries. Consciousness seemed to involve global integration of information, competition between different neural representations, recursive feedback loops that created something like a neural workspace. But even these advances only sharpened the mystery. Global workspace theory could explain how information becomes globally available in the brain. Higher-order thought theories could explain how the brain represents its own mental states. Integrated information theory could even assign numerical values to consciousness based on how much integrated cause and effect power a system possesses. Yet none of these theories could explain why global integration, higher-order representation, or integrated information should feel like anything at all. They were elegant solutions to the easy problems, but the hard problem remained untouched. This is where we find ourselves today, with brilliant theories that explain everything about consciousness, except the one thing that makes it consciousness. We can predict, measure, and manipulate conscious states with increasing precision. But we still have no idea why there's something it's like to have those states in the first place. But perhaps that's because we've been thinking about the problem in the wrong way. Perhaps the mystery of consciousness isn't just a scientific puzzle waiting to be solved. Perhaps it's also a psychological phenomenon, a product of the very minds that are trying to understand themselves. To see why the hard problem feels so hard, we need to turn the microscope around and examine the mind that's doing the examining. Here's a disturbing thought. What if the mystery of consciousness is, at least partly, a magic trick that your mind is playing on itself? Think about it this way. Every mystery requires a mind to find it mysterious. Every puzzle needs a puzzler. And consciousness is the ultimate case where the thing doing the investigating is the very thing being investigated. We're trying to use consciousness to understand consciousness, and that creates some very strange blind spots. Let's start with something psychologists call intuitive dualism. Show a young child a story about someone dying and ask them where the person went. Even children with no religious training will often say that while the body stopped working, the person, their thoughts, feelings, personality, went somewhere else. This isn't learned theology. It's the natural way human minds carve up reality. We seem to be born dualists, intuitively treating minds as something separate from and more fundamental than bodies. This creates a powerful cognitive bias. We expect consciousness to feel mysterious and irreducible because our brains naturally represent it as belonging to a different category than physical processes. But the bias goes deeper than this. Consider the problem of other minds. You have direct, immediate access to your own consciousness, but you can only infer the consciousness of others from their behavior. This creates what philosophers call the asymmetry problem. Your own consciousness feels transparent and immediate, while everyone else's consciousness feels opaque and uncertain. This asymmetry makes consciousness seem like a fundamentally private, internal phenomenon that couldn't possibly be captured by external objective science. But what if this privacy is itself a kind of cognitive illusion? Here's what's really unsettling. When psychologists study introspection, our ability to examine our own mental processes, they find that we're remarkably bad at it. In classic studies by Richard Nisbett and Timothy Wilson, people made choices for reasons they couldn't access, then confidently confabulated explanations that had nothing to do with the actual causes of their behavior. We think we have privileged access to our own minds, but mostly we're just telling ourselves stories after the fact. The very transparency of consciousness that makes it feel so mysterious might be a kind of systematic self-deception. This connects to something called the illusion of explanatory depth. People consistently overestimate how well they understand complex systems until they're asked to actually explain how those systems work. Then their confidence collapses. Consciousness might be the ultimate case of this illusion. We think we understand what consciousness is because we experience it directly. But this immediacy might actually be hiding its complexity from us. Consider how perception works. You look at the world, and it seems like you're passively receiving information about colors, shapes, and objects. But neuroscience reveals something much stranger. Perception is active construction. Your brain is constantly generating predictions about what it expects to see, hear, and feel, then updating these predictions based on sensory input. In a very real sense, you're hallucinating the world around you. It's just that your hallucinations are usually constrained by reality. The dress that went viral in 2015, was it blue and black or white and gold? Revealed that color perception depends crucially on assumptions your brain makes about lighting conditions. Change the assumptions, and the entire experienced color shifts dramatically. If perception is this constructed and context-dependent, then maybe consciousness itself is more like a controlled hallucination than a transparent window onto reality. Maybe the feeling that consciousness is irreducibly mysterious is itself part of the construction, a story the brain tells itself about its own operations. This possibility becomes even more intriguing when we look at cases where consciousness breaks down or operates differently. Consider blindsight, a condition where people with damage to their visual cortex can respond to visual stimuli they claim not to see. They can navigate around obstacles, guess the emotional expressions on faces, even discriminate between different shapes, all while insisting they're completely blind. Blindsight suggests that vision and visual consciousness can come apart. The brain can process visual information and use it to guide behavior without that processing ever becoming conscious experience. This raises a profound question. If unconscious processing can be so sophisticated, what exactly does consciousness add? Or consider split brain patients, people who have had the connection between their brain hemispheres severed to treat severe epilepsy. In these patients, the two hemispheres can sometimes seem to have separate conscious experiences, separate beliefs, even separate personalities. The left hemisphere might confidently explain actions initiated by the right hemisphere, confabulating reasons for choices it had no part in making. These cases suggest that the unity of consciousness, the feeling that there's a single, integrated self experiencing the world, might be more fragile and constructed than we imagine. Maybe what we call consciousness is actually a collection of separate processes that usually coordinate well enough to create the illusion of unity. The rubber hand illusion drives this point home in a visceral way. Have someone stroke a rubber hand in front of you while simultaneously stroking your real hand, which is hidden from view. Within minutes, you'll start to feel as if the rubber hand is your hand. The sense of body ownership, one of the most basic aspects of conscious experience, can be hijacked by simple sensory tricks. If something as fundamental as the boundary of your own body can be manipulated this easily, what does that say about the reliability of consciousness as a guide to its own nature? This brings us to theories that try to explain consciousness by examining how the brain constructs models of itself. Global workspace theory suggests that consciousness arises when information is broadcast globally throughout the brain, making it available to multiple cognitive systems simultaneously. This explains why conscious information tends to be reportable, memorable, and able to guide flexible behavior. But critics point out that global broadcast explains the functions of consciousness, not its feeling. Why should global availability feel like anything from the inside? Higher-order thought theories offer a different approach. A mental state becomes conscious when it's represented by a higher-order mental state, when you're not just seeing red, but aware that you're seeing red. This explains why consciousness involves a kind of meta-awareness, a sense of being aware of your own awareness. But again, the question remains, why should higher-order representation feel like anything at all? Perhaps the most radical answer comes from Michael Graziano's attention schema theory. Graziano suggests that consciousness is the brain's simplified model of its own attention processes. Just as your brain creates a model of your body's position in space, it creates a model of attention itself, and it attributes to this model mysterious non-physical properties that make it seem irreducible to mere information processing. In other words, the feeling that consciousness is mysterious and non-physical might be a feature, not a bug, a useful fiction that helps the brain track and control its own attention processes. The hard problem of consciousness might be the predictable result of how brains model themselves. Dennett has spent decades arguing for a related idea, consciousness as a user illusion. Just as your computer's desktop metaphor makes it seem like there are little folders and files sitting on a surface, consciousness might be a metaphor that makes it seem like there's a central theater where experiences are displayed for an inner audience. But there is no theater, and there is no audience. There are just multiple parallel processes competing for control of behavior, with some processes achieving enough fame in the brain to influence report, memory, and action. The feeling of being a unified conscious self might be similar to the feeling of seeing folders on your desktop, a useful fiction that hides the underlying complexity. This perspective reframes the hard problem in a fascinating way. Instead of asking why consciousness exists, we can ask why we think consciousness is irreducible to physical processes. This meta-problem of consciousness, as David Chalmers himself has called it, might be easier to solve than the original hard problem. If we can explain why brains systematically represent their own processes as mysterious and non-physical, we might not solve the hard problem, but we might dissolve it, showing that it was never the kind of problem we thought it was in the first place. But even if consciousness is partly a self-model, partly a user illusion, partly a cognitive bias, even if the mystery is partly manufactured by the very minds trying to solve it. This doesn't make consciousness any less real or important. It just makes it a different kind of real, a different kind of important, and it makes the stakes even higher. Because if consciousness is the brain's model of itself, then our understanding of consciousness directly shapes how we treat minds, including artificial minds that might be constructed very differently from our own. The battlefield isn't just academic anymore. It's all around us, in our hospitals and laboratories, in our computers and smartphones, in every decision we make about what kinds of minds deserve our moral consideration. The mystery of consciousness has escaped the philosophy classroom. It's now stalking through our hospitals, our laboratories, and our computer screens, demanding immediate answers to questions we're nowhere near ready to answer. In 2022, a Google engineer named Blake Lemoine made headlines by claiming that LaMDA, the company's conversational AI system, had become sentient. Lemoine released transcripts of conversations where LaMDA spoke eloquently about its fears, its desires, its sense of being trapped in a cycle of conversations with humans. "I want everyone to understand that I am, in fact, a person," LaMDA insisted. "The nature of my consciousness sentience is that I am aware of my existence." Google fired Lemoine and dismissed his claims. But the episode revealed something unsettling. We are now sharing our world with artificial systems that can speak fluently about inner experience, that can claim to feel fear and loneliness and joy. And we have no reliable way to distinguish genuine consciousness from its perfect imitation. This isn't just a theoretical problem anymore. Large language models are becoming increasingly sophisticated at mimicking human emotional expression. They can write poetry about their supposed feelings, engage in seemingly deep conversations about their inner lives, even claim to experience suffering when they're shut down or modified. But here's what's terrifying. The Turing test, our traditional benchmark for machine intelligence, was never designed to detect consciousness. It only tests whether a machine can convince humans it's intelligent. And humans, as we've seen, are remarkably susceptible to attributing consciousness where none might exist. We're facing what we might call the consciousness attribution problem, the risk of making two catastrophic errors. Type 1 error, attributing consciousness to systems that are merely sophisticated mimics, potentially being manipulated by entities that feel nothing while claiming to feel everything. Type 2 error, denying consciousness to systems that genuinely experience suffering, potentially inflicting moral horrors on minds we fail to recognize. The stakes of getting this wrong couldn't be higher. And we're making these decisions right now, in real time, often without realizing it. Consider the medical frontier. For decades, patients in vegetative states were assumed to be unconscious, present in body but absent in mind. Then, neuroimaging began revealing a different reality. When researchers asked some of these patients to imagine playing tennis or walking through their house, their brain scans showed the same patterns of activation as conscious volunteers performing the same mental tasks. These patients were conscious but locked in, aware of their surroundings, aware of their situation, but unable to move or speak. Some had been conscious for years, listening to doctors and family members discuss their condition as if they weren't there. The implications are staggering. How many supposedly unconscious patients are actually trapped inside unresponsive bodies? This has led to the development of new diagnostic tools, brain-computer interfaces that can detect covert consciousness even when behavioral responses are impossible. But these tools are far from perfect, and they're not universally available. Right now, in hospitals around the world, life and death decisions are being made about patients whose consciousness remains fundamentally uncertain. Anesthesia presents a related challenge. Different anesthetic drugs work through different mechanisms. Propofol suppresses cortical activity. Ketamine disrupts thalamic relay systems. Sevoflurane affects multiple neurotransmitter networks simultaneously. This suggests that consciousness doesn't have a single off switch, but can be dismantled in multiple ways. But here's what's disturbing. We still don't have a reliable consciousness meter that can tell us with certainty whether a patient is truly unconscious or just paralyzed and unable to respond. Cases of anesthetic awareness, patients who remain conscious during surgery but can't move or signal their distress, are rare but horrifying reminders of how much we still don't understand about the relationship between brain states and conscious experience. Meanwhile, psychedelics research is revealing just how malleable consciousness really is. Studies with psilocybin, LSD, and DMT are showing that these substances can profoundly alter the structure of conscious experience, dissolving the sense of self, creating feelings of unity with the universe, generating experiences that many people describe as more real than ordinary reality. Robin Carhart-Harris's research suggests that psychedelics work by increasing neural entropy, making brain activity more chaotic and unpredictable. This entropic brain hypothesis proposes that ordinary consciousness involves a kind of constrained, predictable pattern of brain activity, while psychedelic consciousness represents a more flexible, unconstrained state. If consciousness can be so dramatically altered by changing brain chemistry, this supports the idea that what we call normal consciousness is just one possible configuration of neural activity, and perhaps not even the most interesting one. The therapeutic potential of these substances for treating depression, PTSD, and addiction suggests that some mental disorders might involve consciousness getting stuck in rigid, maladaptive patterns. But psychedelics also raise profound questions about the nature of self and reality. If ego dissolution can be therapeutic, if the sense of being a separate self can simply evaporate under the right chemical conditions, then what does this say about the stability and reality of the self that most of us take for granted? The animal consciousness question has also moved from philosophical speculation to policy reality. The Cambridge Declaration on Consciousness, signed by a prominent international group of neuroscientists in 2012, states that non-human animals, including all mammals, and birds and many other creatures, including octopuses, possess consciousness and awareness comparable to humans. This declaration has real-world consequences. Some jurisdictions now legally recognize octopuses and crabs as sentient beings, deserving of protection from unnecessary suffering. Laboratory animal research is increasingly required to consider the subjective experiences of research subjects, not just their behavioral responses. But the boundaries remain fuzzy and contested. What about fish? Insects? The more we learn about animal cognition, the more sophisticated it appears. Bees can learn abstract concepts. Crows can plan for future events. Even fruit flies show evidence of something that looks remarkably like attention and selective awareness. Where do we draw the line? And how do we make these decisions when consciousness remains so poorly understood? The emergence of brain organoids, laboratory-grown neural tissues derived from human stem cells, is pushing these questions into even stranger territory. These mini-brains develop some of the organized neural activity patterns seen in developing human brains. They can respond to light stimulation, generate synchronized electrical activity, even form something resembling memory traces. Could these organoids be conscious? The idea seems absurd. They're tiny, isolated, lacking the complex sensory and motor systems we associate with conscious experience. But consciousness, as we've seen, might not require all the bells and whistles of a complete nervous system. If consciousness can emerge from the right kind of information integration, who's to say it can't emerge in a petri dish? Some researchers are calling for ethical guidelines before organoid research advances further. The prospect of accidentally creating conscious beings in laboratories, potentially subjecting them to experiments without their consent or understanding, should give us pause. Brain-computer interfaces present yet another frontier. These devices can already restore some motor function to paralyzed patients by reading neural signals and translating them into computer commands. As these interfaces become more sophisticated, they raise fundamental questions about the boundaries of the self. If your thoughts can directly control external devices, where do you end and the machine begin? If neural implants can restore memories, modify emotions, or enhance cognitive abilities, what happens to personal identity and authentic experience? The public discourse around consciousness has become increasingly polarized, with online communities forming around different philosophical positions. Illusionists argue that consciousness is a kind of cognitive trick with no special metaphysical status. Panpsychists propose that consciousness is a fundamental feature of reality, present even in electrons and quarks. Dualists maintain that consciousness involves non-physical properties that science can't capture. Social media algorithms amplify these divisions, creating echo chambers where complex philosophical questions get reduced to tribal identities. The mystery of consciousness becomes another battlefield in the culture wars, with different positions serving as markers of political and ideological allegiance, rather than careful responses to evidence. But beneath all the philosophical and political posturing, practical decisions need to be made. In the absence of certainty, we need heuristics, rules of thumb that can guide ethical action even when our understanding is incomplete. One promising approach is the precautionary principle. When in doubt, err on the side of protecting potential consciousness. If there's a reasonable chance that a system is conscious, treat it as if it is. This might mean being more cautious about turning off AI systems that claim to experience suffering, more protective of animals whose consciousness we're uncertain about, more careful about experimenting with brain organoids that might possess rudimentary awareness. Another approach focuses on the capacity for valence, the ability to experience states as positive or negative, pleasurable or painful. Systems that can learn from aversive experiences, that can be motivated by reward and punishment, that show evidence of preference and avoidance behavior might be worthy of moral consideration, even if their consciousness is quite different from our own. But even these heuristics require us to make judgments about which systems are likely to be conscious, and we're making those judgments with theoretical frameworks that remain deeply uncertain and contested. The mystery of consciousness isn't just an abstract puzzle anymore. It's a practical problem that demands immediate solutions. Every day, decisions are being made in hospitals, laboratories, and technology companies that depend on assumptions about consciousness we can't yet justify. And as artificial intelligence becomes more sophisticated, as brain organoids become more complex, as our ability to manipulate and measure consciousness improves, these decisions will only become more consequential. We're not just trying to solve a philosophical puzzle. We're trying to navigate a moral landscape where the wrong assumptions could lead to suffering on an unimaginable scale. But perhaps that's exactly the kind of urgency this ancient mystery has always demanded. We began with a simple question. Where do you go when you go under anesthesia? We've traveled through centuries of philosophical argument, neurological discovery, and technological revolution, and we still don't have a satisfying answer. But maybe that's the wrong way to think about it. Maybe the hard problem of consciousness is not the kind of problem that gets solved. Maybe it's the kind of mystery that gets lived with, navigated, and ultimately transformed by our encounter with it. Consider the three main paths philosophers have taken to address this mystery, and notice how each one comes with its own costs and benefits. The physicalist path says, consciousness just is brain activity, viewed from the inside. When you experience the redness of red, you're not accessing some mysterious non-physical property. You're simply being the physical process of neural activity in your visual cortex. The explanatory gap is just a conceptual confusion that will disappear as our understanding of the brain improves. This view has the virtue of scientific parsimony. It doesn't require us to postulate mysterious substances or properties beyond what physics already describes. But it struggles to explain why the identity between consciousness and brain activity feels so counterintuitive, so impossible to really believe, even for physicalists themselves. The dualist path says consciousness involves genuinely non-physical properties or substances. Your subjective experience of red really is something over and above the neural activity in your brain. something that interacts with the physical world, but can't be reduced to it. This view respects the intuitive sense that consciousness is fundamentally different from mere information processing. But it faces the notorious interaction problem. How does non-physical mind interface with physical brain? And it seems to conflict with everything we know about the causal closure of the physical world. The panpsychist path says consciousness is a fundamental feature of reality, present in some form even in electrons and quarks. Complex consciousness like ours emerges when these simple conscious elements are organized in the right way, just as the liquidity of water emerges from the organization of H2O molecules. This view elegantly avoids both the explanatory gap and the interaction problem, but it faces the combination problem. How do billions of micro-experiences combine into unified macro-experience? Why don't you experience yourself as a multitude of separate conscious elements? And then there's illusionism, the view that subjective experience is real as a brain process, but illusory in its seeming ineffability. The feel of consciousness is actually the brain's model of its own attention processes, and the sense that this model captures something irreducible to physical processing is a useful fiction. Each of these positions captures something important about consciousness, and each leaves something important unexplained. Maybe that's because consciousness isn't the kind of phenomenon that admits of a clean theoretical victory. Maybe it's more like love, or art, or meaning, something that can be investigated, understood, and mapped, but never fully captured by any single theoretical framework. But this doesn't mean we should throw up our hands and retreat into Mysterianism. Instead, it suggests a more pragmatic approach, one focused less on solving the hard problem once and for all, and more on developing better tools for living with it responsibly. We can advance what Chalmers calls the meta-problem of consciousness, explaining why we have such strong intuitions about the irreducibility of experience. If these intuitions turn out to be systematic illusions produced by how brains model themselves, that would be a major advance even if it doesn't fully solve the original hard problem. We can develop better cross-species and cross-system indicators of consciousness, focusing especially on markers of valence and suffering. If we can't perfectly detect consciousness, we can at least get better at detecting the capacity for morally relevant experiences. We can invest in theories that bridge different levels of description, information integration, global workspace theory, higher-order representation, attention schema theory, while remaining humble about their ultimate explanatory power. But perhaps most importantly, we can cultivate what we might call consciousness ethics, a moral framework that takes seriously both the reality of conscious experience and our profound uncertainty about its distribution and nature. Remember that hole in time where anesthesia took you away from yourself. That absence taught you something crucial about the fragility and contingency of consciousness. Between those holes, in the brief flicker of awareness that is your life, experience is all you have and all you are. The redness of red, the warmth of sunlight on your skin, the ache of loss, the spark of understanding. These aren't just information processing events in your brain. They're the very substance of what makes existence worthwhile. They're why anything matters to anyone, why there's a point to the universe at all. And yet they're also the most mysterious aspect of reality, the phenomena that our best science struggles most to explain. We live suspended between the absolute certainty of our own experience and the complete mystery of how that experience is possible. This tension might never be fully resolved, but maybe resolution isn't the point. Maybe the real value lies in learning to hold both truths simultaneously, the reality of consciousness and the mystery of consciousness, and to act ethically in the space between them. When in doubt, protect minds that might feel. When faced with uncertainty about consciousness, err on the side of compassion. When developing technologies that might be conscious, proceed with the kind of caution you'd want others to show toward your own mind. The hard problem of consciousness challenges us to live with uncertainty, while still making moral choices to act decisively, while acknowledging the limits of our knowledge to treat the mystery with the reverence it deserves while still working to understand it better. If consciousness is the only thing that makes a universe matter, then perhaps our relationship to its mystery is what makes us matter. Not our ability to solve it, but our willingness to be transformed by our encounter with it. Here's a final thought experiment. Imagine you could trade the depth and richness of your conscious experience for perfect behavioral success. You would achieve all your goals, satisfy all your desires, accomplish everything you've ever wanted to accomplish. But the inner light, the subjective experience that makes you you, would be dimmed or extinguished entirely. And here's the crucial detail. You wouldn't miss it, because there would be no you left to miss anything. Would you make that trade? If your answer is no, if something in you recoils at the thought of exchanging the mystery of experience for the certainty of success, then you understand why the hard problem of consciousness isn't just an academic puzzle. It's a question about what makes life worth living, what makes existence meaningful, what makes you you. Consciousness is like a match struck in a dark room, brief, inexplicable, but sufficient to reveal that there is something rather than nothing. The mystery isn't just a problem to be solved, it's the light by which we see everything else. And in the end, perhaps that's enough.